Hi, thank you so much for listening to Joyscape Therapy Podcast. In order to earn a CE, listen here for the code words, then visit our website at www.joyscapetherapy.com/CEUS. You will enter the code words and your BACB info at checkout, then receive your certificate in 5 to 7 business days.
Hello and welcome. This is Maryssa, McKenzie, your host, and welcome to the Joyscape Therapy Podcast. Everyday behavior for everyday people.
I like that.
Still testing out the slogan. We love it. So today's topic will be about income and race. And then we'll carry that into also like how that impacts or how that has an impact within ABA services. And the article we're reviewing today is going to be Parent-Teacher Problem Solving about Concerns in Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder, the Role of Income and Race. The article is by Ghazi Azad, Sarah Gormley, Steve Marcus, David Mandell, and it was published in February of 2019. And I want to introduce our program manager, a friend of mine I've known for a few years, a colleague, Adriana Lopez Martinez. Go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Yes, thank you for having me here, Maryssa. I'm Adriana, and I've had 5 years of experience in working in ABA. While I took a couple of breaks, to figure out what I really wanted, but I had a lot of really good people that influenced me, like Maryssa, that, you're really good at this, like, try it out. So I was like, you know what, let's do it. And I've always, worked with kids, and I love kids. So I went back. I'm actually in my master program right now. I'm in my 4th semester. I got 2 more. I'll be done this year. Thank God. And right now I'm a behavioral program manager with Joyscape. I'm about to be a year next month on the 28th, right after my birthday. So it's crazy how time flies, and I'm really, really honored to be here because I love learning about new things and different factors that influence our career and, just keeping ourselves informed.
Yes. Nice. And so how about Adriana, outside of ABA and professional life, anything you feel comfortable sharing, of course?
Yes, I do love dancing. I love dancing in my room by myself. Nobody sees me. I use that as a way to just let the stress come out and just, be myself. I do like to ride my bike with my dad sometimes here and there.
What kind of bike?
I have a low rider. Yes.
Nice.
It's very tiring because of the way it's set up, but it's nice. It's beautiful.
Do bike parties and stuff?
Yes. That's one of my bucket list goals, to do more bike shows and car shows here in the Bay. Yeah. So I can see all the different cars. So I'm looking forward to the summer. And I also enjoy painting. Yeah.
Nice. That's
very chill.
No, cool. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So we can go ahead and segue into this article and kind of just briefly break down some of the research and the findings. So I guess let's talk about why we chose this article.
Yeah, I think we did go around so many articles, and this is the one that really stood out to me because I've had so many experience with in my own experience, and working with families from different ethnicities, different cultures, different incomes.
Yes.
You get to see everybody's life of living, and you take into perspective how can I create a better environment to be approachable for people to talk to me if I'm going to be working with them at their home, or even when I go home, right? Talking to my parents, coming from a first generation as a Mexican, with parents who didn't really get to finish school in Mexico, and they had to come here, crossing borders to give my brothers and I a better life. It kind of does play in a role how my parents do depend a lot on me when it comes to hey, can you read this mail? Can you read this bill? What does this bill say? So I feel very honored to be there for them because they didn't really get the opportunity. And when I saw this article, it kind of brought back that nostalgia of like, oh wow, I feel myself in this, what people actually like live through, right?
Yes.
Those language barriers. My parents don't speak English. So I've always been their personal translator, which I don't mind.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I chose this before the other article, because I think I can like relate to it more, and it's still it's an ongoing thing in our career that we see.
Yes.
In ABA.
Especially living in the Bay Area, we have like such a melting pot, right?
Yeah.
Of just many different cultures, a mix of cultures, and, you know, we do have that exposure. So it's really nice in that way. And I know for me, too, I think we were talking about it earlier, it's like I am half Mexican, Hawaiian, I have Hawaiian, Samoan, Filipino, you know, Irish on my other side. So I never really felt like I fit in one, right? I don't know, I'm not fluent in Spanish, so I didn't really identify too much with, you know, like my peers, you know, when I couldn't speak Spanish. And then same on the other side, like, you know, my cousins, Hawaiian, Samoan cousins, I wasn't too embedded into the culture.
Yeah.
So, you know, even just in a day-to-day outside of ABA, like I think race, income, my grandpa was from Samoa. So he came over and just really like made a name for himself. And so even talking about like generational wealth, I know that's also been a fun conversation we've had just outside of work. You know, it's just really crazy to think like we want to be trailblazers and kind of build that for our families. And there are just ways of thinking maybe that were from childhood, right? Or from our upbringing that affect how we act today or how we respond to certain things. And kind of trying to work around those is challenging sometimes, but it also gives there are advantages and disadvantages, just like with anything. So yeah, I thought this topic was a good topic.
It is a really good topic.
Great. Okay, so we'll get into the actual research. So the goal of the article was to find any relations of problem solving between teachers and parents of children with ASD. And so there were 18 teachers and 39 parents. A fun fact was that only one parent was allowed to participate in the study per child. The study was conducted across 13 different urban public schools. Some income, educational, and race statistics were that, so 94% were mothers, 23% were white, 56% were African American, 12% Hispanic, 3% American Indian, 5% identified as other. 59% of the participants had a high school education or less. 77% reported an income less than $45,000 annually. 50% were unemployed, and 64% were not married. So the initial interviews were conducted by the first author and the parents separately. And that's where kind of the breakdown of the research and the study was, you know, answering any questions, clarifying things. And that was done via phone. A separate conversation was conducted with the teachers. Some teachers had multiple parents involved in the study, so the phone interview was not conducted again with that same teacher, but and so that was about a 20-minute combo is what they reported. And yeah, in that convo they expanded on the study, helped build rapport and familiarity with the introduction of this study. They answered any questions, and the demographic information that I just stated earlier was also shared over the phone by all participants. And they did offer an option to do it via paper, but yeah, it was all connected over the phone. And they asked, in this conversation, they asked to narrow down on 3 main concerns in a ranked order to ensure that upon the start of the dyad observation, which was basically the teacher and the parent interaction, that those concerns were aligned to some degree. So kind of saving time. The author just made sure upon these initial phone interviews that the 3 concerns were somewhat aligned. And So they also assisted with speeding up that process. And one of the things the article broke down, right, was the 4 essential elements to problem solving, which made a lot of sense. So they broke it down in identifying a mutual concern, determining the why, planning an intervention for home and school, which I think was really important, of like, you know, holding each kind of environment and also the individuals or the adults in that environment.
That generalization. Yes,
that generalization piece. And then they evaluated the effectiveness of the intervention. Successful components for problem solving. So they mentioned this a lot in the article, right? Primary behavioral components and secondary behavioral components. So the primary behavioral components, which was the biggest focus, was the problem solving strategies.
Yes.
Secondary was the sharing of information about the strengths of the student, the home and the school environment, and suggesting appropriate expectations. So this secondary behavioral component was kind of established and discussed in research conducted by Sheridan and Crotchwell in 1996 and 2007. Supporting research capitalized on further communication and problem solving that contributed to the success were being clear and direct.
Yeah.
When parents and teachers were engaging, they need to be clear and direct, using nonverbal and verbal indicators to convey understanding. So this is essentially even what you had mentioned, like, right, about like even English being a second language.
Yeah.
And kind of taking that into consideration, like those nonverbal cues, just like in our day-to-day work, right? In working with children with autism, language is often sometimes a skill that we want to work on, expand on, right? Some of our kiddos might not have language.
Yeah.
So those nonverbal cues are so essential to understanding the situation, understanding the person, understanding what the person is trying to communicate, maybe when words are not available, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point. Even like with us, right? If when we're sleeping, we're not talking, but our hand pushing somebody's way is like telling like them like move away, right? It's essential to let people know your needs. You know, verbal language is not always there; it's not always needed. But you know, technology, we have all this good stuff that pictures that show these kids how to express themselves in a different way. And I like how the article mentioned that when you do have a conversation with somebody, if it were to be a teacher and a parent, even if the parent didn't understand much of like the English words being communicated, and then they're speaking to the teacher, that nonverbal cues of the teacher nodding their heads, saying, making those gestures, that makes them feel like they do understand where they're coming from, rather than just like sitting there like a statue, not making any type of,
or even just facial expressions sometimes that we don't know we make, right, when we're listening to something, or we agree or don't agree, or it's cringy, it's like really consciously having to be aware of that, is sometimes challenging, but also like that is a way of communicating and can affect when we're talking about effective strategies to problem solving.
Exactly. And especially if you're opening up about your kid with somebody else that has no much of idea of what happens at home, but they do have much of an idea what happens at school, right?
Yes.
So like this article mentioning, like, how can we problem solve both at home and school, right? Yes. Let's find those common concerns that we can both work on and create that intervention so we can both target with each other. Collaboration, right? What we do every day with OTs, speech therapists, teachers, each other, parents. Parents. Because we want, we're not always going to be there. Teachers are not going to always be there, right? They see a kid 5, 6, 7 hours a day. But they also want these kids to succeed at home and have parents like know what to do with their kids. Yeah.
And another like kind of personal experience too when we're talking about nonverbal communication is over the pandemic I did work with a family who had the grandparents in, and the grandparents did not speak English, but they were the most involved. It was a morning session, so they were most involved in session. So anytime we needed something, we need help or participation, like the grandma would like point at her phone or, you know, kind of let us know. And so there are ways to communicate still, right? Instead of just being like, oh, grandma and grandpa don't speak English.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, but that's not going to keep me from, you know, going to them, or even too, right? The child's natural environment is to go interact, right? Like grandma and grandpa are super fun and exciting, right? They're reinforcing.
Yeah.
So oftentimes the kiddo would, you know, wander over to grandma and grandpa's room and want to play and engage. And so communicating was a lot of nonverbal communication.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's imperative that we still, in those situations, right? Grandma and grandpa were here for a year, you know? So it's like, we're not going to get around not communicating to them. And also, why wouldn't we want to?
Yeah,
you know?
you're not going to give up.
Yeah, and we could still, even for us, right, still give those ABA tips and modeling, right? Modeling becomes so valuable there, right? Although there are no words, if grandma and grandpa are watching what I'm doing with the kiddo and facilitating more language, even if the language is different, they're still using those same strategies because of observing, right? The power of modeling. I mean, you really can't. And again, just nonverbal communication. So
exactly.
Super, super effective.
Yeah, I definitely feel what you're saying. I used to work at a health clinic where the most of the people that I work with were Mandarin speakers. And I didn't understand any Mandarin. They didn't understand any English. But, you know, I was at front desk. I want to help you. You know, you're here for a reason, healthcare. I had to pull out the translator and, you know, say,
problem solving.
Yes, like, you know, even model, like, you're here for, because you're sick, get a pen or blood draw, anything like that, and they'll understand me, right? Like you said, words are not always needed to get your point across.
Yes.
I'm so glad that we have our hands and, like, our body parts to model what we need them to get the point across to them.
Yeah. No, good point. So, yes, once again, so some of the problem-solving strategies that contributed to success were clear and direct, using nonverbal and verbal indicators to convey understanding, and engaging without dominating the conversation.
Yes.
These are just basic foundational things that even when we're talking about a supervisee-supervisor relationship, right? BST, behavior skills training,
the sandwich method.
Yes, it is about, you know, like, how are we inviting information? How are we sharing information, whether that be feedback or, you know, just in general? And how do we continue to facilitate that without dominating the conversation?
Yes.
Right? And still allowing that other individual to feel welcomed to comment or engage.
Yeah. Voice, both stories being heard, you know?
Yeah, it is a balance. It is a balancing act sometimes.
It is.
Because I feel like for me, in, like, for example, parent trainings, if I feel like I'm not getting too much from the parent, then I notice myself naturally wanting to talk more. And, you know, and I know that I'm not the only one.
I'm not.
But it's like, you know, I'm getting nonverbal, like, cues of, like, okay, head nodding. But again, that's a good example. Head nodding doesn't always necessarily mean, yes, I understand what you're saying. True. Or, yes, I agree with what you're saying, right? And that's where the non-dominant part of, like, is this an exchange? You know? So sometimes, you know, leaving that awkward silence, as awkward as that is.
Yes.
Or asking, like, open-ended questions, right? Some of those simple, like, tips and tricks that we have to invite, like, hey, what is the barrier here? And how do I figure it out while I'm, you know, in this 1 hour parent training? And one thing I learned, too, was, like, sometimes we might have to get out of the topic, right? It might not even be evolved around what we're talking about. Maybe that parent is, you know, dealing with, you know, one thing or another, right?
Yeah.
That's completely unrelated.
Exactly.
But even sometimes checking in about, like, hey, how was your day?
You read my mind.
You know?
Yeah. Parent trainings are an hour. You know, parents still want to listen to us for an hour of, like, ABA this, ABA that. You know, parents also want to be heard of, like, how are you doing, right? Aside from this, taking those, like, 20-30 minutes, how are you doing? How are you coping with this? Is there something that I can support you with individually, right? Because the parents are still part of the treatment. And I think we get so lost with, like, what topic am I going to teach this parent next about ABA, you know? It's awesome that we have all these amazing topics to teach, right? Like BST is a good topic to talk about. But also, what's a good topic to talk about parents still keeping it ethical about how they're doing, right? How can we transition to that, right? Like, hey, we talked about this, but how are you doing? How do you like, you know, what you're doing, or something that you want to talk about? I always like to leave it open-ended. I tried that and I loved it. I was making a parent goal, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to keep it open. Once I meet with them, I'm going to ask what they want to work on. It will make it a goal, because what if I write something and they don't feel comfortable?
The social significance.
Exactly.
Right? It matters.
It's not dominant, right? I don't want to be dominant in taking every...
Not socially significant to me, per se, but to the parent or to the individual that it's meant to impact, right?
Exactly.
No, I love that. I love that piece. It is like an essential piece. So, yeah, definitely kind of using some of these effective problem-solving strategies.
Yes.
So yeah, I had mentioned, so back to the research or the study, parent-teacher were identified as a dyad, which I had mentioned before. So in the parent-teacher engagement, they had a 7-minute conversation to discuss and identify one main concern, and they had to come up with an intervention that was to be utilized in the home and in the school. So I love that, like we mentioned before, generalization, right? This is not just meant to affect performance in school, but also that piece in home, right?
Yes.
That carryover, because those are the two, most essential pieces for a student, right?
Yeah.
Or a child.
Yeah.
And the measure that the study used was called the PTIQ scale, and that stands for Parent-Teacher Interaction Quality. And this was developed by Mulaney, Gilraban, Sheridan, Baker, Kwan, and Darrow in 2009. So some of the findings, so that was kind of their measure, and some of the findings are, as we mentioned, kind of the correlation between income, rate.
Okay, so like Maryssa had mentioned, we will talk about the findings of the article, starting with the first finding that if communication increased on one side of the party, it also increased in the other side of the communicator. So this is a good finding of how to problem solve between, the parent and the teacher, which then takes us to the second finding of how there was an association of income. So what that means, so if parents made between 25 and 45K, according to the article, there was less problem solving with teachers versus lower problem solving, higher problem solving between 45K with teachers and parents.
Parents who made 45K or above seem to be more effective with problem solving.
Yes, more effective
with the
problem
teachers.
solving with the teachers. Yeah, so that's another question of why does income have a barrier in communication, right? A whole different story for another day, but I want you guys to think about this of why does income and the findings play a big role in problem solving between teachers and parents. And since we're talking about that, race also mattered. According to the article and the findings, teachers' race who were white, parents felt, according to the article, that problem solving was lower than when teachers were not white. So that's a really good finding. This was actually my favorite part of the article because from what Maryssa had mentioned, most of the participants were mothers, right? And the teachers were white. So I like how it correlates together and the findings match what the article was talking about. But I feel like, from my experience, where there had been a difference if there will be more diversity of teachers and mothers. So,
you mean, and maybe even dads.
And dads, exactly.
I wonder what that line of communication might look like.
Yeah.
But remember, too, the unemployment rate was higher. And we mentioned before, like, that might have also been because maybe like that 64% might have been stay-at-home moms, right? Or might have just been unemployed mothers, maybe single mothers. There was a certain percentage, I can't remember off the top of my head. 50% were unemployed, 64% were not married. So yeah, like you mentioned, just kind of like if the pool was a little mixed up a little bit more versus the 94%, right, of it being mothers, if that mode of communication or if that flow of communication and problem solving would have been different.
Yes, exactly. Another thing that came up to me, since we're talking about the income, how that has a really big role in problem solving between teachers and parents, was how different or effective would problem solving be with parents and teachers if instead of mothers, it would have been fathers, right? We do
with in terms of income.
In terms of income. And I'm saying that because men make more money than women, right? In the United States, we all know that. If the income was higher because it was the father just interviewing with the teachers, would that have increased problem solving between the teacher and the fathers? Or I also ask myself, would it have been more intimidating for the teachers? Okay, to wrap up the findings of this beautiful study, the article did express that there was a lot of correlations between income, race, and communication. So now let's talk about
education.
And education.
And the problem solving.
And the problem solving.
Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of if you made more money, like particularly they reviewed like over 45K seemed to be more effective problem solving with the teachers. And those that made below the 45K, they seem to problem solve less, share information less than the counterparts.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of transitioning into like takeaways, and I know we mentioned this as quote unquote like our favorite parts of the article.
Yes.
Or even just kind of like we mentioned takeaways of just the findings in general.
Yeah. My favorite part of the article was the limitations and the future directions, you know. I think the first one that really stood out to me was, and I had mentioned it before, if it would have made a difference, is the diversity in both parties of the parents and the teachers. Since most of the teachers were white and most of the sex of the parents was mothers, like I was mentioning before, 83% were white.
Of the teachers.
And 11.1% were African American / Black of the teachers. 5.6% were American Indian / Alaska Native. So that's one of the findings that the article, one of the limitations, that the article mentioned about making a more, examining more of a quality of direct measures of culture beliefs and making it more of a, instead of a limited sample, but a more expanded, culturally diverse sample. And maybe the findings would have been different, who knows, but that was something that really stood out to me. That was like my favorite part of how can the future directions improve problem solving between teachers and parents. Another one was, rather than, since the parents were examined separately, like Maryssa mentioned, it was just one parent with the teacher, rather than examining dyadic combinations of how one's problem-solving behavior of influence the other person's behavior, was another thing that stood out to me, because, like we mentioned before, creating, if communication increases on one side, it might increase on the other side. So if we were to have more of how if we were to see how that person's problem behavior shows, how can that influence the other
problem
person,
solving.
right? Problem solving. Yes, how can that influence the other person, right? And for example, from experience, as a supervisee, receiving and giving feedback, how would I do that in terms of how well do I know the person and how should I give this feedback to the person, right? Due to how does that person's behavior influence mine? If I am really open to this person, I'm comfortable, then the feedback will look completely different versus if I felt pressured or scared of like giving this feedback, right? So that's something that kind of, I compared with that limitation.
Okay, so just to sum it up, like, you're talking about how one can create a more welcoming environment for the other to continue the communication, or, like we mentioned earlier, to, like, not dominate that conversation. But a lot of that also goes into, like, rapport, right? Like, how well. So consistency is a huge thing.
Yes.
Right? Because, like, if I'm talking to someone once a month, once a quarter, I'm probably not going to feel as comfortable to share, right? They talk about those primary and secondary behavioral components. So this would land under, like, the secondary, right?
Yeah.
The willingness to share information, the willingness to kind of break down what happens at home, or, also to share information of what happens at school. So my willingness to do that, is impacted on, our relationship, or kind of the foundation that we have, or we don't, and how to kind of continue to facilitate that to create a partnership or a collaboration, right? Because, like, if my kid is going to school for X amount of, 30 plus hours a week, I do want to be involved. But when we're talking about income and race, those factors of, like, intimidation, barriers of language, barriers of understanding, differences in culture, all play an impact if I'm going to feel comfortable approaching you if you're the teacher.
Exactly. That's a really good point. From experience, I can relate so much, If I were to be so limited in, like, resources of the way I was raised, like, as we mentioned before, that would influence on my behaviors, right? On how would I respond to somebody who's very educated, higher income, I would also feel very intimidated, like, oh, like, you're the expert, I'm just gonna say yes or no.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that that's something that we see every day, right? Even if it's outside of our work, in our homes, or if you're at a grocery store, you see that every day, and it just makes you think that all these little things can make a difference in talking to people.
Yeah.
And being open. Any
other input too, because like I mentioned, like, consistency is big, building rapport, but, like, what are some things, like, when you're talking about from your personal experience, of, like, speaking to others that, are more educated, or, quote unquote, right? Because, I mean, education, even like academia, right? Because we can all be super smart and not necessarily have a degree, right?
Very
so
true.
I don't want to discount that.
Yeah.
But when we are talking about, like, higher education, in academia, like, what are some ways, like, you have competed with that? Because I know even as an adult, right? Like, as I grow in my professional career, I do feel, like, that imposter syndrome, or, like, oh, can I do this? Like, am I adulting right now?
Yeah.
So there's always, like, that piece, and it is always a struggle. So what are some strategies, like, you've used in the past, or even, now ongoing, that you feel have been helpful?
That's a really good question. As a student still, I'm still learning, and I really appreciate the fact that I'm still learning and working, while it is really hard to do both full time. But I'm not taking it for granted, because it keeps my mind fresh. And when I do encounter people who have their PhD, or they're very knowledgeable about ABA, I tend to feel confident in what I'm saying, even if it's wrong or right, because I've learned that you learn from mistakes, right?
Yes.
If that person were to point that out, oh wow, like, I see where you're coming from, but actually, then I will actually get those real facts, you know, and then
like the corrective.
Exactly, that corrective, and I won't go home with the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
I've always been super open with, like, getting feedback and, like, getting to know people's perspective of things.
Yeah.
That
openness.
Yes, because I like to hear what other people say and acknowledge what they're saying, but I also feel comfortable when people acknowledge what I'm saying and kind of like, instead of being dismissive, you know,
non-dominant.
Non-dominant. You know, if that person is right or wrong, you still want them to be heard.
Yes.
As a student going in classes, right, before COVID, teachers would always, there's no right or wrong answers. Feel confident what you're saying, and we will all work it out together to grow that answer, to improvise that answer, right? Because we live in a world where we experience different things and our lifestyles are so different. So everybody has different opinions. And I respect that. I think that's how I've approached that. Just respecting everybody's knowledge. Not everybody learns the same pace. Not everybody likes to learn. They learn, like you said, you don't need a diploma or anything to like be knowledgeable. People learn from experience, observing, you know, personal things. So I'm like really grateful that I get to experience all of that.
Yeah, I love that. And I also have seen that too, just like working together, right? That confidence that you carry. And, you know, that's a hard thing for every person to have. I think, you know, I admire that about you.
Thank you.
And I think it's important too, like, even for those who don't have it, like, sometimes you gotta push through and like fake it till you make it.
Exactly.
You know, but when we're talking about like kind of going back to like the sample of what the article, you know, was portraying of like income and race do play a role. So like, having those, and when we talk about like, right, we saw that anytime one party communicated more, initiated that communication, it was reciprocated.
Yeah.
So we know that, you know what, when we communicate together, when we collaborate and put that conscious effort forward, even if it's not always comfortable, that it does lead to more problem solving. Does lead to more effective problem solving.
Exactly.
Right. So it's just kind of like, how do we address some of those barriers that keep us, and understanding. I love how you also mentioned like respecting other people's perspective. Same thing when we're talking about race. There are cultural differences that people do not understand, but that doesn't mean that they can't learn and be curious, right?
Yeah.
Just because you don't live in a certain culture doesn't mean you can't understand it, right? But you have to be active in the curiosity, and asking questions and doing your own research, right? Especially for us, like when we're working day to day with children and their families, and you know, trying to get into like what is going to be most sustainable for them, and considering the cultural pieces in that as well, right? Because dynamics plays a role. We can teach something the way we want to teach it, but that doesn't matter. That's not going to carry over if it's not something embedded within their household. If it's not something that's going to be carried on, you know, after
socially
our
valid.
ABA, after our ABA sessions. So, sorry.
No.
That was a good.
It was. I like how we. This article in general was like my favorite article that I've read so far because I was able to like correlate it to work and my personal life, right? And I want the listeners to also, you know, feel some type of like nostalgia of when they were younger, something they experienced, or somebody that they know, right?
Yeah. And we talk about the discomfort. Too. That discomfort is a big thing for both sides, right? They talk a lot about, you know, like, even segueing into like some of my favorite portions of the article, were research conducted mostly in general education population, right? So not necessarily ASD classrooms, but how they reviewed that oftentimes like Latino or African American families were involved in the child's education in ways that could not necessarily be seen by the teacher, or, you know, because, right, different environments, but also like those differences in culture, and the role a parent plays. There's so much behind the scenes, you know, and vice versa, you know. I think when we're also talking about teachers, so just kind of segueing into that of, there are so many pieces at play, and communication, that's really what this is, right? Like when we really narrow it down, communication is key. And the strategies that you mentioned of respect, perspective, you know, wanting to hear or understand that other person's perspective is huge. Sure, confidence is a piece of it, but again, not all of us can have it. But if we approach a situation with openness, oftentimes it will lead us to getting information that is going to help us be better problem solvers.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. I like how you mentioned the communication of the parents and the teachers. I did forget to mention about the findings of how to make future problem solving better was by, like you said, right, keeping yourself informed. So coaching the teachers, right, of training them, right, giving them,
comes from higher up than even just, I mean, we know our school systems are not well, don't have as many resources as, I'm sure they would like, I'm sure we would like. But yeah, just kind of looking at like training above, when we're talking about administrators, funding, things like that.
Yeah, resources to help teachers even build up confidence, right? Role playing, we do that.
Collaboration.
Exactly.
I mean, even for us, like collaborating with so many people, we're talking about OTs, SLPs, families, and all of them also have different income, race, Yeah. So, like, really, how do we continue to get education on that, to understand how to collaborate, and again, communication is a big piece, but understanding of like, okay, hey, these are also the biases I bring to the table. How do I work through my own biases to continue to be effective is a huge piece. I think sometimes maybe we don't see that like central piece of like, I come to the table with my own, right? And so just kind of navigating through that is, a challenge.
It really is, but it's like, it's like life. Life is not like easy. Everything is so hard in life, but it gives you a better outcome, right? And not everything that is easy is good. So
and not everything that is just uncomfortable is good.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Or bad. Yeah. So it's just on how your actions, right? It depends on how you want to see it, that perspective. The outcome that you want from whatever you do, you know?
Yeah. And even within our field, we talk about like motivation, right? What is intrinsic motivation that is going to get, whether it be a parent or vice versa, a teacher, like that's really the sustaining piece, right? Why are we here to talk about in a meeting of what is going to, an intervention that is going to help the student?
Yeah.
And maybe I, from a teacher's perspective, or you from a parent's perspective, is going to say, yes, we're here. We want to problem solve. I think that's a key piece.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And even when we're talking about limitations, I was thinking about it. I'm like, can we be problem solving if we don't know if, like, the follow-up on the intervention that was proposed?
Yeah, checking in.
But can we call it problem solving? Right? I was thinking about that earlier because there still is a piece to it of like, okay, but what's the follow-up to see if the intervention was effective? Was there, what was the communication? Maybe that's part 2 of the research.
I like that. That's like the outcome.
Yeah. And really seeing like, what is the follow-up? What's the consistency? I would have loved to see like a 3-month follow-up, and see how things go. Maybe if they're on to the next kind of concern, or if they found solutions, right?
That is true.
And if in finding solutions, they noticed that communication was more fluid, more effective, just in general.
The consequence might affect the antecedent.
So I think that, talking kind of just on limitations alone, there's always something more to be researched. And I love how they also always put that in, the articles.
And that's a good point you mentioned, though, because the limitations didn't mention anything about following up in 3 months. The studies usually have like, we followed up with participants after 6 months. This is what resulted. But I think that might be a part 2, like you said.
And they always say too, like they encourage there's always more research to be done, right? Like these studies are so important because although they are limited, any research, no matter how thorough, is always going to be like not the full story, right? There's always going to be more that we want, but these studies are so essential because they provide a kind of a foundation for us, right? Like even this conversation, right?
Yeah.
It does bleed into our day-to-day, like work life, personal life, to just pause a little bit, right? And kind of take what we learned from the study and know that, hey, the way me initiating communication to somebody and utilizing some of those 4 elements of problem solving, like they matter.
They do.
And also kind of having a lens that says, okay, who am I communicating to? How am I saying it?
Yes. Those nonverbal cues.
Yes, exactly. Like what lens are they looking at it from?
Yeah.
You know, so just
Exactly.
like some of those pieces that I think are, you know,
Yeah.
the beautiful chaos of it all.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing thing, you know. I don't want people to feel like discouraged, like, oh, that should happen. It's practice, right? You have to practice how to be confident. You have to practice how to communicate with different people.
Yes, apply it.
Apply it, exactly. You have to, like, I practice on how to, you know, talk about this article objectively, right? Because I can say so much subjectively from my personal life. But it takes practice in how you want to word things. Like you said, how you communicate with different people from different careers, right?
Yeah.
How would they see it from their lens? It's all about practice.
Yeah.
Problem solving is, you got to practice that too.
Yes.
The code word for this episode is behavior.
I think that's a great like space to conclude it on. I mean, I loved this time and spending time with you, Adriana.
Yes.
I really appreciate your thoughts and insights and, you know, just everything you bring to the table. The confidence.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And this is a really good opportunity to talk about like one of my passions and outside of work and inside work, you know. I like how we and you were able to collaborate with each other and talk about it comfortably and freely. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's all to like better our field and just outreach. And I mean, I know our little like slogan, like let's see if this works, you know, like if it sticks. But like everyday behavior, because everything we do is, you know, behavior, right? Like the smallest and most intricate things. But I do want the audience to not just be consist of BCBAs or whomever, but like also everyday people who are just trying to understand behavior alone, or even just as we like disseminate and, you know, pick apart these research and really just try and learn and understand what they reviewed and learn from these findings, and sharing that information.
Exactly.
Right? Because again, like, what if we do catch someone that's just being curious? What is income and race as it relates to ABA? You know, like then I feel like we've done what we aim to do.
Yes.
You know? So,
I agree.
Yeah, great. So great, yes. So we thank you again to our guest speaker today, Adriana Lopez Martinez. I just want to say
Thank you.
And so yeah, you can please feel free to find us on Spotify, follow us on Spotify, download on iTunes, follow up with us on Instagram. You can follow us at Joyscape Therapy and check out our website at joyscapetherapy.com. Until next time, signing out.